I'm reading a book from every single country in the world, so let's talk about it. Sorry if I sound all gross and bunged up and sniffly today. I do have a cold. I'll probably be sneezing throughout this video. But today I really wanted to talk about my Reading Around the World challenge. I've been doing this for a while now and it has been so much fun, so challenging, but so rewarding. So this is going to be a whole video talking about the challenge, and I'm going to show you every single book that I have read for each country so far. Some of the countries I have multiple book options, so if you're doing this challenge yourself, I can give you great recommendations of the books that I preferred out of the books that I've read, and also maybe where to steer clear, like books that just didn't really work for me. This challenge has been amazing, not only because I've been loving reading all of these books, but also because I have absolutely loved the community that's been created around this challenge. I have my own book club around this challenge where we read a different book from a different country every single month. That has been so fun, and it's been really motivating for me as well to carry on with this challenge, and it's really nice to be doing this with other people as well. There is always a link to my book club in the description below if you do want to join us.
So if you are starting this challenge, if you're new to this challenge, or if you are a little bit ways through like I am, hopefully this video is inspirational to you. Hopefully it helps you find books from different countries, and even if you're not planning on taking on this challenge in any formal way, although it's not very formal at all, you should hopefully find some good book recommendations in here to help you diversify your reading, read from new perspectives, read some authors that you've never heard of before. So let's jump in. I'm going to go by region. Oh wait, another thing. Just before I start as well, if you do want to do this challenge in a casual way, I do have a Storygraph reading challenge that I host on Storygraph that I can link below in the description as well. Lots of people have joined that. I think there's like 600 people on there now, and I get a lot of my book recommendations from that Storygraph list as well, because everyone can add to every different country the books that they're planning on reading for that country. So it's a great place full of inspiration. I always check there first if I am going to be reading from a new country and I don't know which books to read. So you can join that as well and see maybe how many you've already done for a Reading Around the World challenge, which is so fun. So I'm going to start going through every single book that I've read for this challenge. I'm going to try and keep the reviews pretty short because I have read 24 books for this challenge individually, and then we've done another 10 books, I think, for the book club. So it's a lot of books to go through. So we are going to be doing relatively quick fire, and I'm going to start with Africa, and then we'll go through the different regions of the world. The first book that I read for this reading challenge was for Ghana, and that book was Homegoing by Yagyasi. So glad that I started this one, and actually when I did my first ever video about doing this challenge over on TikTok, this video that I did about this book went viral, or viral for me anyway. It got like 250,000 views, which was insane, and it was just like the first ever, I think to this day the only video that's ever gone very, very viral for me. And it was a great video to go viral because it was me starting this challenge, and also because it was such an excellent book. This is Homegoing. It tells the story of two sisters and their very different ways that their lives pan out, and it also follows the generations that come after them. So it's a generational story. You're not following just the two sisters, you're following their children, their grandchildren, their grandchildren's grandchildren, and the two sisters' paths diverge hugely. One of the sisters stays in Ghana and marries a slave trader, and the other sister is actually sold into slavery. So this book is very heartbreaking, it's very touching, it's beautifully written, it's really well done. Yagyasi is one of my favorite authors. I think I've also read Transcendent Kingdom by them, and it's just such a beautiful book, and I think I actually slightly prefer Transcendent Kingdom because this one for me personally is just very sad, and it's like quite continuously very, very sad, and like I don't have too good of a tolerance for very, very sad books, so that is a warning going in, but it is a very, very beautiful read, and I really, really enjoyed this book. So that is Ghana. For Nigeria, there is so many options that you could read, and I've read a few different books for Nigeria. Two main authors that I recommend for Nigeria are Akweke Emezi and Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. They're two very famous, very well-loved Nigerian authors, and honestly, for my personal preference, I would say I prefer Akweke Emezi's writing style and the type of books that they write. So they wrote Freshwater and also The Death of Vivek OG. So I've read both of these books and they are both really, really good in their own way. And they're also very unique and they're very interestingly written. They feel very fresh and very new, whereas Half of Yellow Sun and Purple Hibiscus and books like it are very beautifully written. I think that they're more classical in the way that they tell the story. I do still really enjoy both of these books, but I would really encourage you to pick up Akwaeke Emezi's books if you've not read anything by them. So The Death of Vivek OG talks about Vivek OG. So Vivek OG is living in Nigeria with their very overprotective mother and kind of distant father, and they are trying to figure out their own way of expressing themselves, their gender identity and their sexuality, and it is just about them growing up in such a kind of hostile environment to those kinds of explorations. It's a really beautiful story about family and identity, and really, really recommend it. And then if you want something a little bit weirder, then there's also Freshwater. That is a journey of a book. It's very poetic. It can be very, very confusing at times. And this is much more of a surrealist book. And I don't want to tell you too much about this one because it's like very much the experience of reading it. But it's basically about Ada, who always feels like something is wrong with her, and she has lots of different things going on inside her own mind. And yeah, that is Freshwater. Next up, we have a book that I don't actually own, but it's one of my favorites that I've read for the challenge so far, and that is from Senegal, and I read So Long a Letter. This is such a beautiful story, and it just like really touched me when I read it. I just really, really loved it. It's basically this very short book. It's just like an elongated letter from the main character to her best friend, and she is talking about how she feels after her husband has just died. But they had a tumultuous relationship and he actually was living with someone else, and so they are kind of split up. It's like kind of her ex-husband, but it's talking about her life, and I really think it gives you such an insight into Senegal and the experience of being a woman in Senegal, and you learn about her life as she's writing the letter. You also learn a little bit about the person that she's writing to, her best friend, who has a slightly different lifestyle, has made different choices, and it's like a very nice like reflective book. But just like, I really, really love this one. It's not too long as well, and if you want to read a book from the whole region of Africa, then this is my top recommendation. You should definitely be reading So Long a Letter. Sorry, I had to pause for a sneezing break. This cold is killing me. But next up we have Uganda, and the book that I read for Uganda is The First Woman. This one is quite a tome. It's quite long, and I think for me that was to its detriment, but I did really enjoy it, and I liked the ideas that it was exploring for me. It just felt like, for me, the length kind of took away a little bit from my enjoyment, so it was like a middling read for me in the end. But basically this book is about Kirabo, and as she's growing up in this small town in Uganda, she starts to question where she's come from, because she grows up with her grandparents but she's never actually met her mother. She doesn't know who her mother is, and so she starts to question who her mother is, where she's come from, and many other different things about her life. And you're following her from her time as a child into adulthood, and it's a coming of age story. But really a major theme about this is feminism in Uganda, but the very essence of like true kind of feminism as it is in Uganda, not this westernized kind of take on feminism. And it's really mixing in Ugandan folklore and the story of the first woman with Kirabo's life and as she's growing up. A lot of this I really, really enjoyed. I just think it was trying to do one too many things, and it should have been a little bit tighter maybe to enjoy it even more. But really intriguing read, and still definitely a good choice if you want to look for a book for Uganda. So we did a book club book for Gambia, and we read Reading the Ceiling. This is actually a young adult book from Gambia, and it had a really interesting concept, but I had kind of higher expectations for it. I didn't love the way that it played out in the end. You're following an 18-year-old girl as she is making the decision of who she should lose her virginity to, and then you kind of follow 3 different life paths that she goes down depending on who she chooses to lose her virginity to. I thought the concept was really strong, and I did learn more about Gambia the country from reading this book, but in the end a lot of the stories kind of felt quite samey to me, and like I didn't feel that a lot of her personality from when she was a teenager like translated to her as a woman. And yeah, so this one was like a middling book for me, but very glad to have read it with the book club. And then next up we have Sudan, and the book that I read for Sudan is Season of Migration to the North. This book I was kind of putting off reading for a while because I felt like it was going to be quite difficult for me to get into, but really it wasn't in the end at all. It was like very accessible and quite a more fun read than I was expecting. This was published in the 60s, and it is all about this man who has been away from his country and from his village for 6 years. He's been studying in Europe. He comes back to his small town, his small village, and there is this other strange man living there, and someone that nobody really knows. And it turns out that this man also has been away from Sudan for many years and was studying in London. And there's basically a lot of tension with our main character and this mysterious stranger, and he's trying to figure out who he is, where he's come from, and if what he's saying about his life story is actually true, because a lot of this story you are hearing about the life story of this stranger and what happened when he went to study in Europe and how he was treated as some kind of exotic kind of novelty character in these people's lives, and how he also got his revenge almost on this polite society. It's about colonialism and this like pushback against colonialism. It's pretty short. It's got this mystery kind of about this stranger and his life story. It's really, really interesting, and I would really recommend it. At times it can be a little bit mystifying or like a little bit like confusing to get into, but overall I really, really recommend Season of Migration to the North. So I think that is everything that I've read for the African countries. So let's maybe move on to Europe. So the first one that I want to talk about is Portugal. So for Portugal, I read Blindness, and I'm so glad that I read this one for Portugal. It's really, really famous Portuguese book, and I was really scared to read it because I've heard a lot of things about the writing style, but I really liked it. So Blindness is basically about this white blindness that overtakes people, where they can see nothing but pure white, and it spreads really quickly. And mainly you are following this ophthalmologist or this eye doctor and his wife, and basically at the beginning of this epidemic, people get sent to live in this kind of abandoned facility hospital, and they have to kind of fend for themselves, but everyone is blind. But there is one twist in the fact that the ophthalmologist's wife is the only one who can actually see. She is for some reason not become blind, but she has to hide this fact because everything is just turning to absolute chaos. This book was really pacey and really heartbreaking, and I love books like this anyway, kind of with this dystopian type end of the world kind of feel, and so I really, really enjoyed reading this book, and I would so recommend it. I would say I did not actually read the physical copy because it has basically just like run-on sentences and not a lot of grammar, not even a lot of paragraphs. It can be quite difficult to get into. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I would highly recommend, because also there's something about it being about blindness as well, and listening to the story, because that's how everyone is experiencing the world in this book, which I think is the reason for it being quite a difficult read, because you're supposed to feel kind of this panicked, like difficult processing, like with your eyes. I think that's like my interpretation of this book anyway. But I would really highly recommend you read this anyway, even if you're not doing this challenge. Next up, for Spain, I've read quite a few different books for Spain. I've read Don Quixote, which took me a long time, but that is one of the most famous Spanish books. I perhaps would not recommend that one for this challenge because it's extremely long, and also it's really not going to be for everyone, and I don't think it was entirely for me either in retrospect. I also have read The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón, and I didn't really like this one that much either. I was really anticipating this, and I thought that I would absolutely love it. I thought that this would be right up my street. This is about a little boy, and his father one day takes him to this secret hidden library and tasks him with protecting one book from this library that is going to basically become extinct if he doesn't kind of like have his personal protection over it, from this library of forgotten books. I love libraries, I love reading, I love books, and basically you follow this boy as he grows grows into a man, and he starts to discover that the book that he has chosen to protect is rapidly disappearing, and someone is on purpose like destroying copies of this book. So you follow him as he figures this out. There's a few reasons why I didn't like this. I didn't really gel with the writing style especially, but I really just didn't like the relationships in this, the relationship dynamics, how the women were written in it. It kind of just gave me like icky vibes, and there wasn't quite enough of the plot to like really pull me through. It was really, really slow. I don't know, I just didn't really love it, and it felt like quite strange that I didn't, because I was really highly anticipating this one, but I didn't really like it, and I was expecting kind of it to be this absolute masterpiece, and for me it wasn't. So that is a shame, but that was Spain for The Shadow of the Wind. And then next up I read from Latvia, and this book is also another one I'd really recommend, and I read Soviet Milk. This one really surprised me, kind of came out of left field for me. I didn't expect to love it as much as I did. This book is about a mother and daughter, and it kind of shifts perspective without you, like from chapter, not even from chapter to chapter, like from paragraph to paragraph, you are slipping between the mother and the daughter's perspective, and you also get kind of the grandparent perspective as well. It's 3 generations in this, and it is about their relationship to their country of Latvia, and also the Soviet Union, and Latvia's relationship with the Soviet Union, and also their relationship with each other. So it's about mother-daughter relationships. It's also set in this like wider political context of Latvia with the Soviet Union and becoming independent from the Soviet Union. I just thought it was done really well, this reflection of these personal relationships with the political. It was really interesting, and it was kind of a difficult read at some points because of the writing style, but really, really well worth it. And I thought it was an excellent book, so really recommend this one for Latvia. Next up, we are talking about the Netherlands, and the book that I chose to read for the Netherlands I did not like at all, but I'm hesitant to put you off this book because it's one of those ones that I really think that some people would probably love this book, but it was not for me. If you like very disturbing and creepy books, then you'll probably love this. But for the Netherlands, I read The Discomfort of Evening, and I literally hated it. I had to literally force my way through this book. It was really, really, really difficult to read. It's very uncomfortable. Obviously, it's in the title. It's supposed to make you feel uncomfortable. It's about the feeling of discomfort. Basically, one of the messages of this book is that when we are feeling discomfort, we're feeling ourselves our most truthful. It's like the most truthful feeling, and it kind of reveals the truth. But basically, this book is about Jazz, and she lives on this very rural farm with her family, and she is really worried that her dad is going to kill her pet rabbit. So she makes a promise to God. She says, like, please don't let my dad kill my rabbit, you can take my brother instead. And then when a tragic and fatal accident happens to her brother, she is kind of like reeling with grief, and the whole family is grieving, and you're following them through this journey of grief. And there are so many disturbing things that happen in this. It does not flinch away from the disturbing and unsettling, and for me it was too much. But if you really like that kind of writing, you might love this. I think it was done well. It made me feel disgusted, so it did its job, but I have to enjoy a book that I'm reading, and I did not enjoy this one at all. So that is The Discomfort of Evening. Next up, another one I didn't love too much, but this is for Italy. So for Italy, I read another very famous Italian book, and it was My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I thought I would love this one a lot more than I did, because this is supposed to be about female friendships and complicated female relationships. Unfortunately, this one really didn't work for me. I found the writing style really difficult to get into, and it might have been because of the translation. I've seen some people who have read it in Italian say that the translation isn't the best for this book, but I really just didn't like this one too much. Not a lot happens in this book. It's quite difficult to explain the plot because there isn't much of a plot. You're following these 2 girls. You're following them as they grow up and how they have different opportunities in their life in terms of education and like their family backgrounds and what that kind of does to them as they grow up. But there was no classical plot. There's no beginning, middle, and end to this book, and I thought that it just really needed it because something about this writing style didn't quite work for me. I do think I'm really in the minority with this one. I think so many people absolutely adore this book, so kind of take my review with a pinch of salt maybe, because something about it just didn't work for me, but it really might work for you. But yeah, that is Italy. And then next up for Poland, I kind of made a little mistake with Poland actually, and I'm going to be reading another book for Poland, but the one that I chose to read was Swimming in the Dark. So the reason I say that this was a mistake to read, it's not because I didn't like this book. I really did like this book. It's very reminiscent of Giovanni's Room. If you've ever read that and you love that, then this is kind of a more contemporary take, I'd say, on Giovanni's Room, but it really refers to that and it's very similar in lots of ways. But I actually kind of broke my own rules by reading this one, I think, because my own rules for this challenge are that the author has to be from the country and also it has to be based in that country. I thought this was a Polish author, and I think he kind of is Polish, but I don't think he ever grew up in Poland, or maybe wasn't born there and it was his parents who are Polish. But it is set in Poland, so I don't know, it's kind of like a half rule break, but people were quite angry with me over on TikTok when I chose this one for Poland. So the one that I'm reading instead is going to be Drive Your Plough Over the Bones of the Dead. I really want to read this one anyway. I'm very, very excited to get to this. And the Fitzcarraldo editions have not steered me wrong so far. So this is the one I'm going to do for Poland as well. If you are also looking for a good Polish book recommendation, then you can read this one along with me. But yeah, so I did enjoy Swimming in the Dark, but I'm hesitant to, recommend it in case you're doing the kind of strict rules like I am with author and being from that country and everything. So that's Poland. Next up we have Norway, and for Norway I read The Ice Palace. This one is such a skinny little book, but it's very, very beautiful, just like the cover. I absolutely adore the cover of this book. This one is about two girls, Sis and Un, and they are quite opposite in so many ways. One is popular and outgoing and very bright, and the other is quite lonely and isolated. But they have one evening where they get to know each other and form this very instant, deep connection. But then one day, Un goes missing in this frozen waterfall that all the children have nicknamed the Ice Palace. And Sis, the girl who's left behind, is left reeling. I really liked this one. It's a very interesting book, and I feel like it has such a specific style as well that I think that lots of people say has the typical Norwegian kind of feel to it. It's quite a dark book, but it's very subtle as well, and like introspective and quiet in its darkness, like I imagine being trapped in a wintry landscape. So I would highly recommend this one for Norway. A great, great read. So next up, we've actually done 3 different European books in our book club, which is very fun. So I'll go through the 3 that we've done so far in our book club. Another reminder, join the book club down below. It's very casual. You don't have to read every single month like that we're doing, but it's very fun. I host it over on Fable. We read chapter by chapter and it's very relaxed and it's a great fun time, and I love chatting with everyone in the book club about the books that we're reading. So we've done, like I said, 3 different books from Europe. The first one that we did, and the first book for the book club in general, is The Pear Field, and this is from Georgia. This book was a little bit of a difficult read. It felt very stark to me. This is about a girl called Layla, and she is just turning 18. She is aging out of this school that she has always lived in, and it's kind of nicknamed the School for Idiots. It's a school for intellectually disabled children. So she is going to be leaving the school soon, but she wants to tie up a few loose ends before she leaves and kind of make sure that she protects the children that she is leaving behind. It felt to me more like a screenplay because of the way it's written. You don't have much emotional insight to the characters, but I did feel like I learned a bit more about Georgia from reading this book and the history of Georgia, so it did do its job in that way. So if you're looking for a good book for Georgia, then maybe try out this one. Another book from Europe that we've done for the book club, we got Estonia, and we read The Man Who Spoke Snakish, and I have so many thoughts about this one, and this one really disappointed me in the end actually, even though I was really, really excited for it and really enjoying it at the beginning. This book is kind of described as a mix between Tolkien, Beckett, Mark Twain and Miyazaki, and I don't see that actually, having read it. Basically, in this book, you are following this young boy growing into a man as he lives in the forests of Estonia It is steeped in Estonian folklore, and it is all about his community and his life as the last person who can basically speak to all animals using this language called Snakish. So he's the last one to ever be taught this, and it's basically because everyone is moving slowly from the forest where they live into living in like agricultural villages because of the kind of importation of this religion from the Crusades that's happening in Estonia at the time. So this book starts off as pretty like magical and whimsical, and it's this boy talking to these animals, and you learn a lot about Estonian folklore and the meaning behind a lot of the interactions with nature and the animals, and at parts it was making me laugh out loud. I was really enjoying it. And then like about halfway through it has a really twisted turn, and it becomes just like needlessly quite violent and very dark, and lots of the choices I just really didn't enjoy, and I just ended up really hating it by the end. And I think if I would have felt middling throughout it would have been fine, but because I was so enjoying the beginning, then the ending just really knocked it down for me. And it's a very strange little book, and there are bits that will always stick with me because of how it's written, but in the end, not a great book in my opinion. Also quite long, so maybe not the best for this challenge, but if you're interested, definitely an interesting one for Estonia. And then the final one that we've done for the book club is actually the book club book for this month, which we did Slovakia. So we chose Away Away. This book is also another really interesting one, and unfortunately one that I have not enjoyed. We've not had the best luck with books for the book club, from Europe at least. This one is a really short book. It's like about 100 pages, and the blurb is very deceptive. It says that it's about this woman who's leaving her husband, and it's kind of using a lot of the characters and themes from The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. It's really not. It's like little vignettes about this woman's life, but it's so confusing to read because the perspectives constantly change. Names are just thrown in there, like new characters are introduced and dropped, and the timeline is just completely blurred, so you never know what's actually happening when. I found it like quite incomprehensible. I think maybe some people would love this book if they understand it. It completely went over my head, and I could not get into it despite it being so short. It was just like too difficult for me. So unfortunately this one was not one that I would recommend for Slovakia. So those are all of the books I think that we have done for Europe, that I've done for Europe. Now let's move on to Asia, which is the most that I've read from, the region that I've read the most from. So let's just jump in. We have a lot to get through still. This video is going to be so long. Let's start off with Thailand. So this is also another one of my favorite books that I've read for the challenge so far. For Thailand, I read The Blind Earthworm in the Labyrinth. I've talked about this book a little bit before on my channel, so you can go and find my video on 6 short books that'll change your life or something along those lines. I can tag it somewhere. But this book is so lyrical and romantic, kind of, in the classical sense of romanticism, and interesting and mystical. So basically in this book you're following 3 young people, 2 sisters and their friend, and how their lives are really intertwined with each other. Something about this one is so well written that it's really hard to put down, despite the way that it's kind of more of it feels like ethereal. It feels very strange to read, and it's very hard to describe. But that's all I kind of want to say as well. I just want to say, pick this book up. Even if you're not doing the challenge, definitely pick this one up. This is one of my favorites that I read for this challenge, and I also just absolutely am obsessed with this cover. I really love this book. Next up, for Lebanon, I read The Prophet, which is like I think one of the highest grossing selling books in the world. This is a very famous book, and also I really liked it. If you are the type of person who likes beautiful quotes, then definitely read this book, because there are so many quotable things in this, and so many quotes in this book that I recognized from people's like speeches and poems and how much it's referred to. But basically in this book you are following a man who has been in this community for a long time, and he is leaving it, and he is this like wise man, this prophet, and so the community comes to him and they are asking him these questions that they want advice on before he leaves to go back to his home. And so each chapter is just on a different aspect of life. There are things like the family, crime and punishment, freedom, pleasure, beauty, religion. There's so much in here, and there's so much good advice that just feels age old and eternal as well. It's a beautiful read. It won't take you very long. This edition also has some really beautiful artwork and illustrations in there. It's just a very nice read. It's a nice thing to have, and I'm really glad that I read it, and I'm glad that I own it. So that is Lebanon. Next up, for Sri Lanka, I've read a couple of books for Sri Lanka, and I have a favourite out of the two. So I read The Seven Moods of Mali Al-Maida, and I've also read A Passage North. Out of the two, A Passage North is my favourite of the two. I really just enjoyed this one a little bit more. But let's start off with The Seven Moons of Mali. It's kind of pitched as quite like a Dickensy like retelling, in the fact that this is like Mali, like the ghost Mali, because basically you are following Mali, who has died, and he has 7 moons to basically kind of come to terms with his life and make peace and finish what he started. So you're following his journey as he's visiting people in his life. But also there's like this political plot that's going on. It's set in Sri Lanka in 1990, and Mali is a photographer and basically has seen a lot of atrocities that have been happening, and he has a lot of information that could be used for very different purposes. So you're following him and also his kind of like moral journey that he's going on as well. I liked it, but I didn't love it. I didn't really get on with the way it was written, even though it's a very cool concept. But I did really enjoy The Passage North. This is basically about a young man as he is traveling north for a funeral of the woman who looked after his grandmother. And basically he is going on this journey throughout the country of Sri Lanka, and he is going also on his own journey as he's looking back on his life and looking back on the people who have really affected him and reflecting a lot. It's a very reflective book, but I just really liked it. I like the way it was written. It's very quotable. I've highlighted and tabbed, which I don't often do. There are some really beautiful like lines in here that I really enjoyed how it's written, even though it doesn't have like as exciting of a plot, I would say, out of the two books. Something about this one really hit home for me, and I really enjoyed it. Next up we have Iran, and another very confusing book. I read The Blind Owl. This is another one that utterly went over my head, unfortunately. I think the way it's written is supposed to be quite evocative of like the fact that you, like, it feels like you're doing opium. Like the main character is also, I think, an opium addict. It's very difficult to describe the plot of this because it's one of those books that is very, very confusing and very kind of up and down and all over the place. It's very difficult to describe, but you're kind of following this man as he's thinking about a relationship or in a relationship, and I don't know. To be honest, I don't know if I could recommend this one because I would need to study it. I wish that I actually studied this academically, or I had someone to explain to me the meaning of what's going on. And also I think the translation for this one is quite difficult because of how it's written. The translator's note in this is actually very interesting because they were explaining the way that it's been translated is very difficult to translate the original. But this is a classic of Iranian literature. I'm kind of glad I read it, but I also wish that I'd read it alongside like a study guide or something. So that's Iran. Next up we have South Korea. I've read a lot of books from South Korea actually. Let me just give you a taste. I've read If I Had Your Face. I have read Yoke. I've read Kim Ji-young, born 1982. I have read Almond, and I have read Winter in Sokcho. Out of all of these ones, I would say my favourite is probably... I really enjoyed Kim Ji-young, born 1982. This is a really interesting book, and it's basically following the typical woman. It kind of uses statistics to track a woman's life living in Korea, about all the decisions that she has to make, and kind of follows the statistical average of a woman and shows how difficult it is to live as a woman in Korea. And it also sparked a huge movement in Korea against sexism and this like very pro-feminist movement, which is very interesting, and I'm really glad I read this one. It also doesn't take too long, a really interesting read. I also really enjoyed If I Had Your Face. This is much more about the beauty standards in Korea and kind of living there as a young woman currently. You're following 4 different women, young women, and they're all like living in the same apartment block, and it tracks their different lives and the different relationships with their bodies, with friendships, with work, with kind of this beauty standard. And I really, really enjoyed that one as well. But honestly, I think Korean literature is one of my favorites, like favorite countries that I've read from. I've read a lot of Korean literature, not even just the ones that I've shown. I've read a few others as well that I don't physically own. But yeah, I really enjoyed Korean literature in general, and I would love other recommendations if you do have any. Next up, for Afghanistan, I have read A Thousand Splendid Suns, and I've also read The Kite Runner by the same author. What more to say is that about these books? Beautiful, devastating, heartbreaking, amazingly written. They're classics, like modern classics for a reason. I feel like most people will have heard of these books or read them. If you haven't read them, absolutely do. They are very poignant, very heartbreaking. Thousand Splendid Suns is more from a woman's perspective in Afghanistan, and The Kite Runner is more from the male perspective. But both of them track a kind of heartbreaking life, and both of them are very, very well worth the read, well worth your time. Excellent books. I won't say much more about them because I'm sure you will have already heard of those books, but that is Afghanistan. Next up, for Oman, I read Celestial Bodies, and unfortunately I didn't love this one. This one I think is one of the more famous translations from Oman, and there's nothing too bad about this. It didn't kind of irritate me in any way, but I also didn't love it. It was just kind of like a book that I read, and honestly I read this a few months ago and I kind of can't remember too much about it. The blurb says that it tracks these three sisters and their kind of decisions on how they get married, and or if they do get married, and like tracks their lives. It's not quite like that. It's actually a lot more from a male perspective in the actual book. You hear a lot more from one of the sisters' husbands, and also one of the more interesting sisters. You don't get to hear that much about her life. It's just kind of like tacked on at the end as an afterthought. A lot of this book was actually more about like masculinity and kind of like, I don't know, male ego as well, which I just don't particularly love. There were aspects of it that I really liked, but overall kind of a middling read for me. So next up, for Iraq, I read Frankenstein in Baghdad. This one is a really interesting read. I love the original Frankenstein, so I was excited to read this one, and it's a very interesting take. It's quite difficult to read at times. I would say it's a little bit dense, but I really liked the concept of this. Basically, this is following Baghdad at war. So you are in the rubble-strewn streets of Baghdad and bombs are constantly going off. And that is one thing that this book really does well, is it really evokes this atmosphere of this city kind of like on the verge of ruin. And you follow this man, and he is a trash collector, and then he starts collecting different body parts from people who have been blown up from bombs, and he stitches them back together, and then he goes back to see the body and it's disappeared. And you kind of are following a few different characters. You're following a journalist, you're following the person who put this body together, and then you also get perspectives from this Frankenstein body who is out for revenge. It's very interesting. Like I said, it's a great concept and parts of it are done really well. I just think some parts of it were a little bit difficult to read, but this could definitely be really good recommendation for some people, and I would say it's definitely worth exploring for a book for Iraq. Next up is another book club book, and we read for Indonesia. We did Happy Stories Mostly, which is actually a short story collection. I'm really glad that we read this one actually, because this is all about living in Indonesia but also being like out of the norm, out of the normality. It explores sexuality and gender expression and different ways of living, but also is like obviously heavily steeped in Indonesian culture. And I actually ended up reading this twice. I read it before I read it with the book club, and then I reread it with the book club, and I really enjoyed it a lot more the second time because I realised how much the stories speak to each other from story to story, how themes come up and how characters are kind of interwoven. Some of the stories are really interesting, some of them obviously not as great, but that's just normal with a short story collection, so I would definitely recommend this one for Indonesia. Next up we have Japan, and that is another country that I've read a lot of books from, so let me just show you the selection of books that I've read from Japan. We have If Cats Disappeared from the World, we have Kitchen, we have Breasts and Eggs, Lonely Castle in the Mirror, Convenience Store Woman, and Before the Coffee Gets Cold. And there's also other books that I don't actually own that I have also read from Japan, but these are, I think, the ones that are set in Japan and also have the author who is Japanese. Out of this selection, I would recommend most of these. I would say I really loved the most out of all of these is Lonely Castle in the Mirror. Absolutely love this book. It's a really strange and beautiful story, so this would be my top recommendation. This is about a group of school-aged children, and for one reason or another they they don't want to go to school anymore. And one day in their bedroom, their mirror starts shining and they can touch the mirror and go through it, and they are transported to this lonely castle. And basically once they get there, there is this wolf queen who's on the front cover, and she sets them the task to unravel these different clues, and the person who does it first can have one of their true wishes kind of come true. So all of these children have different wishes that they want, and it's really sweet. I think it touches on a lot of themes that come up in a lot of different Japanese literature about bullying, making friends, and it's just very, very sweet. I really, really love this story. Also, the plot is so interesting, twisty and turny, very surprising. So it has this beautiful, quiet story to it, but then also kind of almost in the background is this like very engaging mystery. So it really keeps you guessing, and it's just an absolute wonderful read, and I really, really enjoyed this one. The other ones from this stack that I'd recommend is Convenience Store Women. I really love this one. I won't go into too much about this. I think it's very well beloved already, but I really, really enjoyed Convenience Store Women, and I really want to read more from this author, so I definitely will be. But yeah, that is my Japanese stack. I won't go too much into it because this video is already too long for me to do that. Next up, we have another book club pick, and we actually got North Korea for the book club. So the book that we ended up choosing, which was quite difficult to find, is The Accusation by Bandy. So obviously we had actually a bit of a difficult time finding a fiction book from North Korea, from someone who lives there or has lived there and also is set in North Korea. So these are short stories by an author who is anonymous and still anonymous. But it is believed that they are still currently living in North Korea. But I really loved this. It was such an insight into North Korean society, and the stories themselves were really beautiful, really poignant and tragic, and they really show the everyday normal lives of people who are living in North Korea. And it just felt like such an unseen kind of insight into a world that we have no, access to. I really, really enjoyed this one, and I would highly recommend it. Really, really glad that we read this as a book club together. It's a great discussion that we had. So that is North Korea. Another book club one that we've done for Asia is we've recently done Pakistan in the book club, and we read Moth Smoke. This one is another one I really, really enjoyed, and I knew I would like it. I've heard a lot about this author. He's also got a book called Exit West that I've heard of, but this one is set in Pakistan, so this is why we chose this one. And I was really pleasantly surprised by this book. The way that it's written is really its strength. So this book is all about Daru, who loses his job, and then he kind of quickly his life quickly disintegrates. He has no money and he kind of has no prospects, and he basically kind of slides into ruin, and he starts up an affair with his best friend's wife. But this one is written in such an interesting way, in the fact that there is lots of different perspectives in this story, and also there are these kind of excerpts where you are the judge. It literally writes out a courtroom drama where you as the reader are in the position of judge, and you judge the moral actions of the characters as you're reading the book. You hear their backstories and them talking about themselves and their reasonings for the actions that they did. It's just really interesting, kept me engaged the entire time. I really enjoyed it. Also gave me such an insight into contemporary Pakistan. It's really talking about the rich and poor divide and corruption and friendship and betrayal. A really, really interesting book, and I really enjoyed this one for the book club. Okay, so I think that is Asia done. Hopefully I've been a bit quicker this time. Okay, we need to keep moving on because I've been talking for hours and we still have a few countries to go. Let's do the Americas. I have not actually read that many books from North, South or Central America, but I have done a couple of countries. So let's talk about them. Firstly, Mexico. I have read a couple of books by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which I've really enjoyed. But I think technically she's an American Mexican. I think that she was born in America. So if you're being more strict on this challenge, I also do try to be most of the time. These books are great, by the way. I love Silvia Moreno Garcia. Excellent reads. I really enjoy her writing. She writes in all different types of genres. So this one's a crime noir. Then we have more of a classic horror. She also does fantasy romance stories. She does historical romance. She does everything, and it's great. They are all very, very fun. She's an excellent writer. But if you're looking for a 5-star read from Mexico, I have recently read Stillborn by Guadalupe Nettle, and I love this book. This is going to be on my top reads of the year, definitely. I cried. I just absolutely loved this book. So if you are looking for a Mexican book to read, this one is the one for you. This is basically about two friends, and they both decide that they don't want to have children, and one of them decides to be sterilized so that she actually can't have children, and the other one then kind of changes her mind and later on decides to get pregnant and have a child. And it is about that pregnancy and the fact that it is a difficult pregnancy and the difficult decision whether or not to have children or not to have children. And it's also really deeply about their friendship and like the beauty of their female friendship, and kind of about what having children can do to your life and also not having children and kind of how you live your life. I just never see this kind of topic discussed so delicately and so intellectually, but also so emotionally. I felt really connected to this book. I loved it as someone who has decided not to have children, but I also do love children. I love having children in my life. I felt really seen by this book, and I just really enjoyed it. It made me cry, and not even like the aspects that you would think would make me cry in this book. Like, it was kind of like the beauty of lots of the scenarios that were making me cry. It's just such an excellent read. It's not very long as well, and it's really beautifully written. So I can wholeheartedly recommend Stillborn. If you pick only one of the books from this video, then definitely try Stillborn, but be aware it does cover some very dark and potentially triggering topics. So if you have some sensitivities around motherhood and children and pregnancy and that whole thing, then have some awareness maybe going in. But yeah, an absolutely beautiful read. Next up, I have also read from Brazil, and the book that I read is from a very famous Brazilian author, Clarice Lispector, and I read The Hour of the Star. I actually have an entire live show where I discussed this book with my friend Rachel. We had a great discussion about this. This was another one of the book club books, and I'm really glad that I got to have a really in-depth discussion with Rachel about this book because it's a complicated read. It starts off very big, it has all these huge ideas, and then as you read the book they kind of come down into like smaller, more digestible chunks, I would say, as you read the book, but it's quite complicated and quite difficult to read, especially at the beginning. But this book is basically about this man who is an author, and he's writing the story of this girl, and he's writing this story about this girl, but obviously holds her in quite a lot of contempt, as in like he does not think that she is beautiful or clever or the way that she's living is good, and she just is basically a pathetic human. But he's kind of obsessed with writing about this girl, this character he's invented. There's a lot of really interesting ideas in this, and it's one that I would want to reread again, and I do really want to explore more of Clarice Lispector's work, but very interesting read, and you can watch the live show for the full breakdown discussion of us talking about this book, but it's a really interesting one from Brazil. Okay, moving on, let's talk about books from the Caribbean. I've read a few different books from the Caribbean, and I have some options here for you as well. So maybe let's talk about Cuba first. I've read 2 books from Cuba, and I enjoyed both of them, but they are quite different. So we read Havana Year Zero for the book club, and I really did enjoy this one. And I've also read the Dirty Havana trilogy, which was a very interesting read. But basically, let's talk about Havana Year Zero first. This is about a woman who's a maths lecturer at a university, and it takes place during the height of the special period, which is a really unique time in Cuba's history in the early 90s. And basically, like, the whole country is kind of going to ruin because of the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But basically, you're following this maths lecturer as she becomes kind of involved in this mystery about the original inventor of the telephone, and the fact that this person invented the telephone while living in Havana. So her and her friends become kind of obsessed with proving this fact and finding this evidence of this man who invented the telephone before the person who everyone thinks invented the telephone, and they kind of want this evidence to come to light. But really, this was actually just such a fun read to me. It reads kind of like quite gossipy, and you're following this main character as she is going round and having different relationships with men in her life as well, and also trying to unravel lies that are being told to her. And it's great, it's really fun. I really enjoyed reading this one, and it's like quite a fast-paced read as well. I would really recommend. And then the Dirty Havana trilogy, on the other hand, is like utterly different. It is the name of this is very accurate, because it's a dirty book. Like, everything about it dirty, not in just like a sexual way. also that way though, but like actually like just filth. Like everyone, it's set in the same time, so it's set in Havana during the special period, and you're following a man who is basically on the brink of ruin, and he is just getting through the day any way he can. And it almost reads like short stories. Each chapter is kind of a different period of his life, and it kind of jumps up and down in a timeline, and it's just like every single chapter comes back to the same things of him going and sleeping with prostitutes and like drinking loads of alcohol and like stealing and lying and cheating, and like it's, in some ways it's very fun, in some ways it's like quite disgusting, but I'm also pretty glad that I read it, and I was laughing out loud at some of the outlandish things that was happening in this book as well. But out of the two, if you are looking for one for Cuba, I would say Havana Year Zero probably I prefer. Next up we have Colombia, and I've read one author but two books for this country. First book that I read is The Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and then I also read his other book, 100 Years of Solitude, which I never thought that I would read, because basically when I read this one I absolutely hated it. I literally despised this book so much. I think I've probably talked about this before. I've definitely talked about it over on my TikTok. I hated this book with a fiery, burning intensity. The main character in this is my literary nemesis. I despised him. I hated following him. There is so, like, the treatment of women in this book is so uncomfortable. And I'm not saying that I can't handle when books are written in a, like, sexist society and, like, things are happening that are bad to women. That happens in basically every single book. But the way that women are treated in this book, and the way that sexual assault is treated, the way that there is paedophilia, the way that children are treated, it's a whole mess, and I literally hated it. It's not romantic, it's not good, and I hated it. Even though like some parts of it were very beautifully and evocatively written, the setting and none of it was enough for me to remotely like this book. I literally hated it, and I might do a whole entire video on it when I have more energy talking about the reasons I hated it. But when I said that I hated that one so much, everyone was like, well, you read the wrong one. You should have read 100 Years of Solitude. And I thought, I'm not going to do it to myself again. I can't. Like, I've read that one and I just can't do this author again. But then I did eventually read it. And I actually kind of liked it. I was really surprised that I actually liked it. And I'm glad that I kept an open mind, because I wish I read this one first. It is a lot better. The kind of moral messaging also behind it, it feels like you are kind of saying that these things are bad, even though they are present in this story. Some of the like problematic aspects are present. It's done in a way that I feel like makes sense, in the fact that certain characters and decisions are punished for their decisions. So I'm not saying that this is like a much, more calm and clean version. It's not. There are still definitely tragic and dark things that happen in this book, but it just feels like a better thought out book, basically. This book is about this family, this founding family in the town of Macondo, and basically it's the founding family, and you follow the 100 years in this family's life, and basically the theme of time and how it's inescapable and kind of fatal flaws, and like it's very interesting. I liked how it's written. I really thought it was very well done. The characters are so interesting and unique. This whole entire town, you could just imagine it so vividly, and yeah, I just really loved the magical realism aspect of it as well. It was much stronger in this book than Love in the Time of Cholera. I didn't really get any magical realism in that, whereas in this it's much stronger. So if you're picking a Gabriel Garcia Marquez book, 100% go for this one. Do not bother with Love in the Time of Cholera. Next up for the Caribbean, I've also read a book from Trinidad and Tobago, and I read The Bread the Devil Need, which for some reason is such a difficult book to say, like it's a difficult title, but I really enjoyed this one. I wouldn't say it was a new favourite, but I really did enjoy it. This is basically about a woman who's just turned 40. She owns her own shop, she is thriving, she is in a relationship, but she witnesses a murder outside the front of her shop one day, just after she's turned 40, of a woman who's killed by a jealous and abusive lover. And it really kind of triggers a lot of her own thinking about her own life and her own relationships and kind of the patterns that she's trapped in. I really liked this. I thought that it's written in such a unique way, because it's written in a kind of like dialect as well for Trinidad and Tobago. So definitely a good pick for if you want to read for Trinidad and Tobago. Okay, we are almost at the end. And we have 2 books for Oceania, is what I'm calling this region of the world. So another book club book we read for Samoa, and the book that we read was They Who Do Not Grieve. Unfortunately, this was another one of them. This was a miss for me. This was very steeped in folklore and kind of a very lyrically and poetically written, but it meant that it was a little bit impenetrable to me at times. This is trying to weave together 3 different generations of Samoan women and kind of talking about this one tattoo, or this like incident that had happened around a tattoo that was done, and how that's carried out through the generations. But it ended up being a little bit of a miss for me. It was an interesting read in some aspects, but I did not love it. So that's Samoa. And then for New Zealand, I have read Potiki, which is a book about a small Maori community living on an island in Potiki. And it's basically about how their community is being threatened by tourists and developers who want to come and steal the land and build kind of tourist destinations on the land, and then what they do about it. I really liked this one. I didn't love it, but I thought it was really interesting. I'm really glad that I read from an Indigenous author for New Zealand, and I feel like I learned a lot about Maori culture and community. And I really liked the message of kind of banding together once this like ancestral land has been threatened by these outside forces. So that is the one that I read for New Zealand, and that I think is the end of this video. I have been talking for far too long. I have no idea how long this video is going to be. I've like sunk down and down in my chair as well, like as this video has gone on, and I need to drink some water because my throat is completely dry. But thank you so much for watching this video if you have got all the way through. I really hope that there's some good inspiration for you here if you're doing this challenge, if you are joining me on the book club, if you're joining me on the Storygraph challenge, then I hope that this helps you, and this kind of gives you a good indication of where to start and some good recommendations for some books. I would love more recommendations in the comments if you have any. All of the good books that I've found have been recommendations from people in comments, in the comment section on my TikToks or on YouTube. So I really hope that you've enjoyed this video, and please remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and go and like and watch all my other YouTube videos, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye!